Hello, and welcome to Spurbs Herbs, episode 104. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about stevia, which is something I think most of us are really well aware of and know about because it's a well-known sugar substitute. We're going to look at whether or not it has some herbal functions. And so we're going to look at it as an herb, not just a sugar substitute. But we're going to talk a little bit about it being a sugar substitute as well. And without further ado, let's get into it. Today we will explore another interesting herb of the world, Stevia or Stevia rebaudiana, known for its sweetness, but are there other medicinal properties? We're going to find out as we do our usual deep dive into the herbs and find out if there's any evidence or concerns. And as usual, we'll be adding something a little different. We're going to do a deep dive into carbohydrates and sugar, both from a biomedical, biochemical perspective and a Chinese medical perspective. When I do that, we're talking about sugar today, sugar substitute, so I thought that would be a good one for us to do a deep dive into. And we're going to go into quite a bit and pretty hardcore. So we're going to start that in just a minute. It's going to be another daunting trek into the unknown. Well, it's actually known, but we are still going to trek, and it is still daunting, so please keep listening. Before we get going, I want to let you know that we are starting an amazing special for our courses. If you use them for continuing education, professional development, or just for your own edification, we are offering 50 hours of courses for an unbelievable price. Normally this would cost $750. However, with the special code 50CEUs, 50 CEUs, it's 50CEUS, this is going to be only $325 or only $6.50 per hour. Plus, you can get a free signed copy of one of my books, just pay for shipping and handling. That is a free copy of Integrative Pharmacology, combining modern pharmacology with integrative medicine, or Playing the Game, a step-by-step approach to accepting insurance as an acupuncturist. Just go to the webpage www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org/CEUS1, CEUS1. So that's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org/CEUS1 for this amazing deal. So with that, let's get into an introduction to carbohydrates and sugars, because that's what we're kind of talking about, sweetness today. So I thought sugar would be a good thing to do. We'll start off with a biochemical and biomedical approach. This is actually from my series, Integrative Nutrition series, and this is episode 3, Carbohydrates in Chinese Medicine. So we're going to be talking about it and it's all about biochemistry, and then it gets into supplements that are used in these sort of things. So we talk about with carbohydrates, we talk about things like enzymes to help carbohydrate digestion and things along those lines. So it's a very interesting course, and so that's not quite available, but it's going to be available soon for viewing. But let's get into it. Carbohydrates are exactly what they say. Carbo means carbon, and hydrate means water. So carbon and water, that's what carbohydrates are. Pretty straightforward. So they are molecules made up of carbon and water. Of course, water is H2O, so hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon molecules, and are the most abundant organic molecules in nature. They are a significant portion of calories and energy for most organisms. That's one of its major functions in the body, is for energy use. They also can store energy in the form of starches and glycogen, and they can play a role in cell membrane intercellular communication. That's very important, maybe not as important as what we're talking about today with the sugar aspect of it. In non-human forms of life, they can be a structural component, including in the cell walls of bacteria, exoskeletons of insects, and the cellulose of plants. The basic formula for many simple carbohydrates is CH2O. CH2O, which really is carbon and water, but N, those three, CH2O to the nth, where N is 3 or greater. So that's the basic formula. So you have at the basic, if N is 3, that would be C3, so three atoms of carbon, 6 atoms of hydrogen, and 3 atoms of oxygen. So that would be the basic, but it can go 3 or greater. We're actually going to talk about what those look like in a moment. Let's discuss some basic terminology involving carbohydrates. So we're going to talk about those carbons in just a second, but before we do that, let's talk about monosaccharides, literally meaning one or single sugar. So mono meaning one and saccharide meaning sugar. So one sugar are often named based on how many carbons are in the sugar. So remember we said 3 carbons are minimal, and 3 carbons are trioses. For example, glyceraldehyde, which we haven't discussed familiar, but is an important component of metabolism. So that is a big one. That's trioses. 4 carbons are tetroses. 5 carbons are pentoses. An example is ribose. And if you are familiar with ribose, even if you don't think you're familiar with ribose, if you know DNA or RNA, DNA means deoxyribose nucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. So it is, both of those have this sugar in there. So ribose is incredibly important as a sugar in the body. 6 carbons are hexoses, and a very common example is glucose. Glucose is the most abundant sugar in our bodies, and so that is a 6 carbon sugar or hexose. 7 carbons are heptoses, and 9 carbons are nonoses. And so those are the basic types. Can you have more than 9 carbon sugars? I'm going to say theoretically yes. I can't think of any that I've come across in my studies necessarily, though at the same token I don't think I can think of nonoses either, any 9 carbons either. So they may be out there, but they're probably not common in humans. So these monosaccharides can be linked to other monosaccharides with glycosidic bonds. So glyco meaning sugar bonds, basically glycosidic bonds. 2 monosaccharides create a disaccharide, and we're going to talk about quite a few disaccharides. Those are very important when it comes to our diet. Oligosaccharides are formed from 3 to 10 monosaccharides, and polysaccharides are formed from more than 10 monosaccharides and can contain hundreds of sugars, lots and lots of sugars. Isomers are molecules that have the same chemical formula but different structures. So for example, C6H12O6, so that's a hexose, 6 carbons, can form fructose, glucose, mannose, and galactose. Those are all very different sugars. So same chemical formula, different structures are isomers. If isomers are different structurally around one carbon atom, they are called epimers. For example, glucose and galactose are epimers, as they differ only in the position of an hydroxyl bond, an OH bond, around the 4th carbon. That's the only difference between glucose and galactose. So they're epimers, not just isomers. So all epimers are also isomers, but not all isomers are epimers. Epimers are more specific. So there you go. I do have some pictures, which doesn't help very much on a podcast, but if you want to see some of these a little bit more in depth, I definitely cover that in that course I was talking about earlier. Sometimes isomers are mirror images of each other. So that, it's like looking in a mirror. And these are called enantiomers and are designated as D and L sugars. Most sugars in the human body are D isomers. The D refers to the Latin dextro, meaning right, and the L refers to the Latin levo, meaning left. So one is right-handed, one is left-handed. That's really what the D and the L means. This right and left refer to where the hydroxyl group is attached to a specific carbon atom. That's all it is. One hydroxyl group is in a different position, basically. Well, they all are kind of flipped because they're mirror images, so they're all flipped. And I have a picture of L-glucose and D-glucose, and we see that. So on one side, we have a hydroxyl group, a hydrogen group, a hydroxyl group, a hydrogen group, and that would be an L-glucose. But if we look at the D-glucose, then those are all flipped. So it's all the opposite. So instead of hydroxyl, hydrogen, hydroxyl, hydroxyl, hydrogen, we have hydrogen, hydroxyl, hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. So, and the hydroxyl groups are on the opposite sides of the hydrogen groups. I know, we're getting a little complicated. Okay, moving on. Enzymes that can convert between the D and L forms are called isomerases. Remember, an ACE, it means enzyme. An enzyme is something that helps reactions occur faster. And in fact, so fast, without many enzymes, they would be so slow, the reactions would be so slow that they would be irrelevant. They would never really happen. So enzymes are incredibly important in the body, and there are times when we need to convert between D and L forms, and so we need isomerases, and that is the enzyme that does that. Almost all, over 99% of monosaccharides of 5 or more carbons exist in a cyclic or ring form in solution. The oxygen reacts with another hydroxyl group in the sugar molecule to form a loop. The carbon near the oxygen becomes asymmetric, having different atoms attached to each of the carbon's 4 attachments. Carbons always have 4 attachments. And this carbon is called anomeric. So this is just some definitions here. So we already mentioned monosaccharides can be joined or polymerized to create di, oligo, or polysaccharides. Physiologically important disaccharides include sucrose, which is table sugar. When you buy sugar, it's sucrose, and that is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. Lactose, which is in milk, so that is the sugar that's in milk, is galactose and glucose. And maltose, which you're actually familiar with, malted balls and things that are made out of maltose, those are 2 glucose molecules, so that it's a disaccharide of glucose and glucose. There are several important polysaccharides, which are all polymers of glucose. We have branched glycogens from animals, and starch and unbranched cellulose, which are both from plants. So when we talk about starch, it's more of a plant. When we're talking about animal forms of polysaccharides, they're glycogens. Carbohydrates can be attached by glycosidic bonds, which we already mentioned, to non-carbohydrate structures, including purine and pyrimidine bases in nucleic acids. So remember, we already mentioned RNA and DNA, and we know the R, it means ribose, and the D means deoxyribose in these nucleic acids. Remember the deoxyribose nucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. But the other parts of the nucleic acids, they always have one of 2 types of bases. They have a purine base or a pyrimidine base, and those are where the different letters come in. If you know A, T, G, C for DNA, you will know that half of them are purines and half of them are pyrimidines. So that's what that is what we're talking about. So if we have ribonucleic acid and deoxyribonucleic acid, then we have to have carbohydrates attached to a non-carbohydrate structure in the DNA and RNA. Also, aromatic rings such as those found in steroids. So if you're familiar with steroids, steroids are incredibly important. They're basis of a lot of the hormones in the body. And so testosterone and estrogen are all steroid hormones. And so steroids are incredibly important. And we have this carbohydrate to non-carbohydrate bond in those cases as well as some proteins and lipids in addition. So there's lots of different structures where we have glycosidic bonds to non-carbohydrate structures. If the group on the non-carbohydrate molecule in which the sugar is attached is an ammonia group, which is NH2, then the bond is called an N-glycosidic link. If the group is a hydroxyl or OH group, then the bond is an O-glycidic link. Note, all sugar-sugar glycosidic bonds are O-type linkages. So when we're talking about disaccharides and polysaccharides, they're all O-glycosidic links. So let's talk a little bit about how we digest these sugars. Carbohydrates are primarily digested in the mouth and the intestinal lumen. Digestion is rapid and uses enzymes that hydrolyze, which means they break down by adding a water, hydrolyzed glycosidic bonds known as glycoside hydrolases. So again, that's the ACEs means enzymes. So these are enzymes that will use water to break down glycosides. And the shorter name for this glycoside hydrolases is glycosidases. So we kind of eliminate the hydro from it. So glycosidases is another term for these enzymes. Endoglycosidases, so endo meaning internal, break down polysaccharides and oligosaccharides, and disaccharides break down disaccharidases. So these are enzymes that break down double sugars, break down tri and disaccharides. So these are the names. So we have endoglycosidases, so that's an enzyme, and disaccharidases. Ultimately, the final products of carbohydrate digestion are glucose, galactose, and fructose monosaccharides, which are then absorbed by small intestine cells. Digestion starts in the mouth with mastication and salivary alpha amylase. And so that alpha amylase does break down the starches and the sugars. This is relatively brief, with the alpha amylase randomly breaking down alpha 1,4 bonds. We didn't get into alpha 1,4 bonds or beta 1,4 bonds, but we're mentioning them here. These are just types of bonds that have, and the 1 and the 4 are talking about the number of carbons. When you actually see these sugars, the carbons are numbered from 1 through 5 or 6, depending on a pentose or a hexose. Humans only produce enzymes to break down these bonds and do not have beta 1,4 endoglucosidases. This means we cannot digest cellulose. Remember, cellulose is from plants. We cannot digest cellulose. Because we can't digest it, that becomes fiber. Fiber is something that is not digestible. So cellulose makes up the bulk of our fiber in our diets. The digestion of carbohydrates stops in the stomach due to its acidity, which inactivates alpha amylase. So you're chewing, you're mixing up the alpha amylase, you're starting to break down all the sugars and starches, and then you swallow and it goes into the stomach and the acid stops that process cold. When the stomach contents hits the small intestine, the acid is neutralized by pancreas secreted bicarbonate, and pancreatic alpha amylase restarts starch digestion. So we pick it right back up where we ended in the mouth. Finally, in the duodenum and upper jejunum, remember these are parts of the small intestine. The duodenum is the most proximal portion of the small intestine. That's the part that the stomach empties into. It's the topmost part of the intestine, small intestine, and the upper jejunum. The jejunum is the rest basically of the small intestine. There are several disaccharidases, so these break down di and trisaccharides, which are transmembrane proteins on the brush border of the luminal surface of intestinal cells. Wow, that's a lot of verbiage here. So transmembrane proteins, so enzymes are generally proteins. They're transmembrane, which means they go through the cell membrane on the brush border. The brush border is what we call the inside of the small intestine. And it's called a brush border because it looks like brush. There's a lot of invaginations and a lot of brush-like structures that are all made up of intestinal cells. So these go through those cell membranes, and luminal means on the inside rather than the outside of the small intestine. And so that's what we're talking about. We have all these disaccharides that are basically attached to the cell membranes on the inside of the small intestine. Some of these enzymes are isomaltase, maltase, sucrase, and lactase. And since we know already some of the names of these sugars, we can understand that, like, maltase is going to break down maltose, sucrase is going to break down sucrose, and lactase is going to break down lactose. And lactase, of course, is one of those things that A lot of people do not have the enzyme, lactase enzyme, and have trouble digesting lactose from milk and have stomach discomfort from it. That is lactose intolerance, is because of that. So once polysaccharides are broken down into monosaccharides, they're mostly absorbed in the upper jejunum. This absorption is different depending on the specific monosaccharide. For example, galactose and glucose are taken into enterocytes, which are intestinal cells, by secondary active transport that requires a concurrent uptake symport of sodium ions. So what that means is it requires energy. And that's an interesting thing. It's active, which means energy. And the active part of that is you need ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy molecule in the body, or the most prominent energy molecule in the body is maybe a more accurate way to say it. And you require that in order to push sodium ions outside of the cells. And so that takes energy. And then when we release and allow those sodiums to come back in, it brings galactose and glucose in with it. So that is how that works. The transport protein is the sodium-dependent glucose cotransporter 1, or SGLT1. That's actually really important. There are drugs that affect SGLT1. These are newer anti-diabetic drugs that are quite useful because of this, and it basically prevents the absorption of glucose. This is generally very efficient, and all digestible carbohydrates are absorbed before reaching the lower jejunum. However, if there are any problems, genetic or acquired, in the breakdown of disaccharides into monosaccharides, undigested carbohydrate pass into the large intestine. Think in terms of lactose intolerance. You're now having lactose going into the large intestine. Here they cause osmotic pressure and draw water into the large intestine, causing diarrhea. Additionally, bacteria will ferment the remaining carbohydrates, creating 2 and 3 carbon compounds, which also cause osmotic pressure. They also release carbon dioxide and hydrogen gases, which can cause abdominal cramps, flatulence, and further diarrhea. That all sounds like lactose intolerance to me. And of course, it's not just lactose, it's other disaccharides as well. Over 60% of the world's adults and up to 90% of adults of African or Asian descent lack the enzyme lactase. So that's a lot of people who cannot break down lactose. So that's an overview of sort of the biochemistry of carbohydrate and biomedicine of carbohydrates and sugars. Let's get into sugar and Chinese medicine. So the White Rabbit Institute, which I find I use quite a bit, they have some really good articles that kind of combine Western herbology and Chinese herbology. I find more often than not they come up in my searches when I'm looking for sources. I don't necessarily seek them out other than doing web searches, and they have good articles. And so they had an interesting overview of sugar in terms of Chinese medicine. Sugar is tang in Chinese and enters the spleen and stomach and is sweet and neutral in temperature. Its actions include it is moistening, invigorates qi, and it tonifies the spleen and stomach. In small quantity, it, quote, supports healthy digestion, helps moisten the intestines and nasal passages, supports brain and muscle activity. In larger quantities, it can cause dampness and other health issues. So in other words, like many things, in small quantities helpful, in large quantities it is not. And I would say it's almost impossible to avoid larger quantities if you're eating any sort of processed diet in the developed world. In traditional Chinese medicine, craving sugar is a sign of a weak digestive system. They consider excess sugar to be agitating and disruptive to the functioning of the body's systems as a whole. Too much sugar can result in a condition they call internal dampness, which can lead to sinus congestion, water retention, athlete's foot, and other damp conditions. In the right amount, it is considered nourishing, giving cells the energy they need to function properly. So There you go. That's sort of a breakdown of Chinese medicine. And like I said, it's very difficult to get not get too much. If you're eating anything out, the sugar is added to everything. At least in the U.S., sugar is added to many things that are made in restaurants, especially fast food restaurants. And most, one of the things, there was a huge lawsuit I read about. I think it was in the UK, where they actually there's so much sugar in Subway bread. Subway, the restaurant chain, there's so much sugar in their bread that it actually technically qualified as cake in the UK rather than bread. And so that's that's just kind of normal. Lots of sugar all over the place. And I want to say something else here too about sugar, and I'm going to repeat it when we talk about stevia as well, because one of the things is, as I've always been very interested in nutrition and studied it for a very long time at this point. And I'm at the point now where I think the major issue with our diet is not what it's made up of. Sure, we need to maybe eat less red meat, more vegetables, and have more of a heart healthy diet. I agree with all of that. But I also think and studies are showing this, I think one of the big issues is how much our food is refined, even if it's something like a carbohydrate, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of our food is so refined, ultra processed, that that ultra processing in and of itself is dangerous and has health considerations. And sugar is ultra processed. I mean, you go from sugar cane, which is a sweet grass, basically, is what it is, and we process it and process it and process it until it's a white powder, and then we add that white powder to all sorts of things. So not only do I think sugar as having too much sugar in and of itself is an issue, but the fact that it's ultra refined, I think, is an issue in and of itself as well. And so we need to take that into consideration with all of this. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about stevia as well. So without further ado, let's get into stevia and talk about what stevia I don't know if it's rebaudiana or rebaudiana. It's Rebaudiana, and that is the species name, with the genus being stevia. Comes from the family Asteraceae, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. The species is Stevia rebaudiana bertoni, and we're actually going to talk about bertoni when we talk about the history of this herb. So remember, when we look at species, if there's a name attached to it like bertoni, that's the biologist who first classified it. As they discovered/classified it. The medicinal part is the leaf. Other names are Eupatorium rebaudianum, candy leaf, candy herb, Paraguayan sweet herb, sweet leaf, sugar leaf, green stevia, rebaudioside A, Stevia eupatoria, Stevia purpurea, stevioside, and yerba dulce, honey yerba, purvia, and truvia. So when we look at stevia as a sugar substitute, we're really talking about refined, what are known as steviosides. That's sort of a general term for it. And the big stevioside of that is the rebaudioside A. That's probably the primary one. And so those terms here, stevioside, rebaudioside A, are actually refined portions of the stevia leaf itself. And the purvia and truvia are brand names of these refined substances. And those are actually purvia and truvia, at least in the US, are brand names of stevia sweeteners. So if you go and buy stevia from the store, it's going to be truvia, purvia, or some generic of those. And it's going to be primarily rebaudioside A, which, by the way, we're going to see later, has 300 times the sweetness of sugar. So that rebaudioside A is very, very sweet. Okay, let's talk about the Asteraceae family. According to Britannica, the Asteraceae family, also called Compositae, is commonly known as the aster or daisy or composite family of the flowering plant order Asterales. Asterales. It includes more than 1,620 genera and 23,600 species of herbs, shrubs, and trees distributed throughout the world. It is one of the largest plant families in existence. So large that we've already talked about this several times, and we're going to talk about it in our next episode again too. So this is a very common family. There are many well-known plants in this family, including many garden ornamentals, weeds, including dandelion, ragweed, and thistle, food crops like lettuce, artichoke, safflower, sunflower, and endive. And as we discussed in episode 9, artemisia or wormwood, episode 51, songertzau or xanthium, in episode 85, neobongsa or Arctii fructus. And we're going to, like I said in our next episode, talk about juhua or chrysanthemum flower. It also is part of this as well. Members of the family have flower heads composed of many small flowers called florets that are surrounded by bracts or leaf-like structures. Bell-shaped disc florets form the center of each head. Strap-shaped ray florets extend out like petals from the center and are sometimes reflexed, bent back. Another interesting article agreed with this overview and looked at how this family plays a role in human health, including antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and antimicrobial activity, as well as diuretic and wound healing properties. So a lot of these are very helpful medicinally as well. Let's talk about its history. This herb is a relatively recently used and discovered herb. Stevia is native to South America and was used by the indigenous people, especially the Guarani, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Guarani, for centuries. They used the leaves to sweeten beverages such as yerba mate and chewed them as a sweet treat. They called it, and I have no clue how to pronounce this, ka-ha-ye, I guess something along those lines. It's K-A-H-E-E with a tilde on top of it. Or just, and that translates as sweet herb. So that's where that name comes from, sweet herb. Europeans discovered it in the 16th century. It was scientifically discovered in Paraguay by Moises Santiago de Bertoni in 1899 and named Eupatorium rebaudianum. In 1905, so 6 years later, it was defined as Stevia rebaudiana and became a member of the sunflower or Asteraceae family. 8 glycosides responsible for the plant's sweetness, for example, stevioside and rebaudioside, were discovered in 1931, relatively recent, early in the chemistry revolution, by the French chemists M. Bridel and R. Lavielle. Again, pronunciations, please excuse me. Its use as a sweetener began in Japan in the 1970s. It is primarily cultivated in Paraguay, Kenya, China, and the United States, and to a lesser extent in other parts of the world, including Vietnam, Brazil, India, Argentina, and Colombia. In the United States, the FDA first assessed stevia in the 1990s and did not approve it as a generally recognized as safe, a GRAS. That is a legal term, generally recognized as safe, which means there's really no legal oversight on it. They did not approve it in the 1990s, and it remained banned for all uses until the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, of 1994, which as herbalists is in the U.S., that is an incredibly helpful and very important act of 1994, which basically says the FDA needs to prove something is dangerous before it can ban an herb or a supplement from the market, which is the exact opposite burden of drugs. Drugs have to prove that they're effective and safe before they can go on the market. So DSHEA is hugely important in herbalism in the United States. At this point, it was at 1994. At this point, it was permitted to use it as a dietary supplement, but not as a food additive, so you couldn't add it into food. Similarly, the European Commission in 1999 banned its use in food. So these are, relatively recent situations. In 2006 and 2016, the World Health Organization found no adverse effects. In 2008, the FDA approved Stevia for GRAS status, so that's generally regarded as safe status, to Truvia and Purvia, which both use Stevia rebaudiana derived rebaudioside A. So that's that rebaudioside A that we were talking about earlier. Interestingly, the FDA in 2015 still thought Stevia was not an approved food additive and say that it has not been affirmed as GRAS in the United States due to inadequate toxicological information. So if that sounds contradictory, it isn't. What the FDA is saying is in 2008, the rebaudioside A, the refined chemical from Stevia, is GRAS. That's generally regarded as safe. But the herb itself, Stevia rebaudiosum, is still not approved, is not GRAS, and is not an approved food additive. So you can put the rebaudioside A derived from Stevia in food all day long in the US, but if you were to grind up the leaf and put it in food, that would be against the law. So it's a very interesting distinction, but we'll see it's probably not an inappropriate distinction. And in fact, in 2016, so that was 2015, in 2016, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is now ICE, issued an order of detention for Stevia products made in China based on information that the products were made using prison labor. So that's an interesting aspect of it. So that's some of the recent history, the past history and up into the recent history of Stevia and its derivatives. Let's talk about some of its traditional uses. So it did have some traditional uses. It was used as an herb. Traditionally, Stevia is primarily used as a sweetener. In Paraguay, a tea made from the leaves of Stevia rebaudiana is used to treat diabetes and as a contraceptive. It is supposed to be prevent pregnancy. Beyond these traditional uses, there are several potential medicinal uses for Stevia. Its use as a diabetic and hypoglycemic agent is a common use, though the evidence is minimal for this use. The other common medicinal use of this herb is as an antihypertensive agent. So it's supposed to lower blood pressure. While there's some evidence for this use, as we will discuss under the heading of science, more is necessary. I don't think its use as an antihypertensive is really warranted by the evidence at this point, but at least there's some positive evidence to it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Stevia has been looked at as a weight control substance, and the idea, of course, is that it's a sugar substitute. It lowers calories. It also prevents hyperglycemia. Things along are supposed to prevent hyperglycemia. Again, the research on this is not good, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Ashan, Bashir, and Shah discusses these uses of Stevia as well as it being antioxidant, anti-hyperlipidemic, so it helps lower cholesterol, anti-tumor, so it's anti-cancer, nephron and hepatoprotective, so it helps the kidneys and liver, as well as antibacterial and antifungal. It's very interesting. It has lots of different potential functions. We'll see if these hold up. Taylor, author of The Healing Power of Rainforest Herbs, says its main uses are for sweetening, lowering blood sugar, increasing urination, which we haven't heard of yet, lowering blood pressure. If something increases urination, it usually will lower blood pressure, and dilating blood vessels. So that, the fact that it is lowering blood pressure and dilating blood vessels can be very useful for cardiovascular conditions. Taylor also says other uses include killing bacteria, fungi, and viruses, and reducing inflammation. So that's another thing that I haven't really talked about too much, but anti-inflammation came up quite a bit. I mentioned under Ashan, Bashir, and Shah that it's antioxidant, they were kind of also saying antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. So there is some anti-inflammatory aspect traditionally, that is thought to be from this herb. We'll look at the science of it in just a minute. Dosage and preparation. Drugs.com says the acceptable daily intake of stevia is 4 milligrams per kilogram. So that's kind of the maximum that you want to use. So whatever your weight is, 4 milligrams per kilogram. In clinical studies, 250 to 500 milligrams of 250 to 500 milligram capsules of stevioside 3 times per day have been used. One study used 1 gram of leaf powder for 60 days. So that wasn't an extract at all. So that may seem like a lot, 1 gram, but it really isn't. When in Chinese medicine, most of our herbs are in the 6 to 12 gram per day sort of situation. If something's really dangerous or strong, we might go down to, there's probably some that are half a gram a day, but usually 1.5 grams per day. So 1 gram is actually of the leaf powder is not a huge amount. Quality. Generally, the effects of stevia are from extracts and specific chemical derivatives. In other words, the quality of individual leaves and plants are not generally relevant given how much processing goes into its use. So that's the thing. We're really talking about its primary use is these ultra processed aspects, constituents of stevia rather than stevia as a leaf. It is an herb. It is used when we just talked about some of the potential properties, some of the uses for it. But even a lot of those uses we talked about are not from the leaf. They're actually from these extracts and derivatives. So, a lot of the hypoglycemic is from the stevosides. It's not from the whole leaf. So a lot of this, I kind of feel like when we're talking about stevia this whole time, we're actually kind of talking about 2 different things. We're talking about the derivatives of stevia, which are specifically stevoside and rebaudioside A, and then we're talking about the whole leaf itself. And the research is very heavy on the steviosides and rebaudioside A extracts, as opposed to the leaves themselves and using it as a whole extract. A whole herb extract. And so it's a lot of what we're talking about are those refined substances. And we'll talk about that when I get into some other aspects of this as well. Let's talk about some Chinese medical actions of this. I was unable to find anything specifically discussing stevia in terms of Chinese medicine, so we need to speculate. It's obvious it is sweet and based on the slight bitter aftertaste of its extracts, bitter. So that's the biggest complaint about using it as a sweetener, is that it may have a slightly bitter aftertaste after it. So people are really turned off. It can be turned off of it as a sweetener. It should enter the spleen as it is the organ most affected by the sweet taste, and also the same token, quite possibly the stomach. Here's where it gets tricky. Since it does not raise blood sugar, does it also have some of the functions of regular sugar? Does it regulate the qi, moisten, or tonify the spleen and stomach as sugar does? That's the question mark. So let's look at this by looking at some of the pharmaceutical effects to hopefully illustrate Chinese medical effects. Since it may help diabetes, which is considered a yin vacuity in Chinese medicine, it may very well be moistening. If it had some hyperlipidemic effects, we might consider it to be damp and or phlegm clearing or blood invigorating. However, while this has been shown in mice and in vitro, which means in lab, glass is technically what it means, the sole clinical study does not show these effects. So I wouldn't say it's damp or phlegm clearing necessarily. Some of the other potential effects, such as being hepatoprotective and anti-tumor, may indicate some liver qi and possibly blood regulation. So it may move the liver qi and the blood. Often when we see antimicrobial activity, we think in terms of heat and or toxin clearing. However, the evidence of this is also minimal. Given all of this, it seems stevia is sweet and bitter, enters the spleen and stomach, near neutral in temperature, and slightly moistens the yin and possibly mildly regulating the liver, qi, and blood. That would be where I'd put the Chinese medical actions for stevia. Of course, I'm always open to other ideas. If you have a different perspective on that, I would love to hear. So let's talk about some comparisons and combinations. There are lots of possible sugar substitutes on the market. Several are chemical in nature, including aspartame, erythritol, and xylitol. Erythritol lately has been found to have many deficits and may promote several diseases, including cancer and cardiovascular disease. And unfortunately, erythritol is often combined with stevia extracts in sugar substitutes on the market. So, right now, I would say at all costs avoid erythritol as a sugar substitute. I think the research on that is even in relatively small quantities, it can be a dangerous sugar substitute. And as I said, some of the preparations of stevia include erythritol. So I would be very cautious of anything that combined it with erythritol. Another relatively common botanical substitute for stevia is monk fruit. And so that is an interesting potential other one. In fact, I'm going to say probably better, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The White Rabbit Institute has a nice monograph on monk fruit or lo hong guo. Remember, the White Rabbit Institute is what I use for the sugar side of things in Chinese medicine, and they go into monk fruit as well. To me, monk fruit seems to be a bit of a better sugar substitute based on the preliminary research. I haven't done a deep dive into it, so take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But I gotta say, after doing this whole lecture on stevia, I think stevia is probably a better choice than sugar in a lot of things. But I also think that the stevia extracts that are available to us as sweeteners may have things attached like erythritol that may not be useful. It also is it's ultra processed, again, just like sugar is. And I'm at the point where I think the ultra processing is almost as bad as the sugar is itself. So I don't know if I'm as big a fan of stevia coming out of this as I wasn't a huge fan going in necessarily. I was neutral. But I think if I were to choose a sugar substitute, I'd want to work with monk fruit and see if that is something that I could do. But I'm also concerned because monk fruit is by the same companies that make Stevia, and they do have ultra fine little sugar packets for it as well. So I'm wondering how much refinement goes into monk fruit, and I haven't done that research yet. So there you go. So monk fruit is Cereatiae grosvenorii and is from southern China. It's also known as Buddha fruit, lo hong guo, which we already said is lo hong guo, but this is a wei jiao, so it has, instead of G-U-O, it's K-U-O. It's still pronounced guo. And arhat fruit. That was a fruit I was not familiar with. According to the White Rabbit Institute, it is sweet and cool and enters the large intestine and lung, and clears heat, moistens the lungs, supports yin, stops coughs, longevity tonic, dissipates nodules, and moistens the intestines. Ann Christensen from the Institute has a video comparing various sugar substitutes, and I have that link here. It's www.whiterabbitinstituteofhealing.com/herbs/monk fruit with a hyphen between monk and fruit. So that's whiterabbitinstituteofhealing.com/herbs/monk, MONK, hyphen fruit, FRUIT. She clearly believes monk fruit is the best sugar substitute, with stevia as a second potential choice. So there you go. Like I said, I haven't done my deep dive, but I'm tending in that direction as well at this point. So contents. Primarily, there are two major constituents of stevia, at least where its sweetness is concerned: stevioside and rebaudioside. These are both considered steviol glycosides. There are many forms of rebaudioside, which are called rebaudioside A through F. Both stevioside and rebaudioside have much more sweetening power relative to sucrose or table sugar. Depending on which specific chemical, it is 150 to 300 times more sweet than sucrose. Other steviol glycosides include ribososide, steviol monoside, steviol bioside, and dulcodice A. These are not as abundant and while still much sweeter than sucrose are not as sweet as stevioside and the rebaudiosides. Have a comment here from Hunter. Yes, agreed. Monk fruit can be water processed, and stevia allegedly needs solvents to process. Not taking a deep dive either. Personally, I get monk fruit without additives. It's hard to find. Frontier is the only company that carries raw and green ground stevia that is not an extract. I have no idea how well it works in food or drink. Thank you, Hunter. Appreciate that. Hunter is a frequent listener and has a really good insight on a lot of these things. So appreciate that very much. Thank you. All right. Continuing contents, stevia also contains vitamins A, B, and C, minerals such as iron, zinc, and calcium, electrolytes such as sodium and potassium, proteins, and other elements. It also contains 9 essential amino acids and 6 fatty acids. So that's not bad. We need essential amino acids. That's not bad, but I'm sure the quantity involved in these is minimal. So even though it does contain the 9 essential amino acids and 6 fatty acids, several of which are essential fatty acids, they're not in quantity that would be useful to the body unless you're taking way too much of it and then be worried about a lot of other issues. So let's get into that science. So we talked about a lot of the actions of stevia. A couple of very small studies, n equals 12 and n equals 6. That's incredibly small and not statistically valid. We're always looking for at least 30 to 40 subjects, n equals subjects. We want 30 to 40 subjects before we can even apply population statistics. And population statistics are necessary to determine whether or not it's useful for a population rather than just basically, here's a small little group, may or may not be useful for an overall population. These are way too small to make any generalizations, but they showed benefit to diabetic patients. The systematic review and meta-analysis looking at various effects of stevia glycosides found no significant effect on hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of long-term sugar control. Another systematic review stated a pair of small studies also report positive results with respect to glucose tolerance and response, although the relatively low methodological rigor of these experiments limits the strength of these findings. And I think they were talking about those 2 results that were talking about those 2 very small studies. Those 2 very small studies popped up everywhere in my research. So again, low methodological rigor of those experiments limits the strength of these findings. So I find this no proof whatsoever that it helps diabetics. What I would say is these are interesting pilot studies that would say, okay, maybe there's something here. Let's do a bigger study and see if there actually is. That's what these studies mean. It does not mean that it actually helps diabetic patients. So it just shows like it might help it. At least it didn't, I'd be very cautious to say it helps diabetic patients based on any of the research. That same systematic review we just mentioned also looked at stevia treating hypertension, and concluded evaluation of 2 long-term studies, 1 and 2 years in length, respectively, indicates that stevia may be effective in lowering blood pressure in hypertensive patients, although data from shorter studies, 1 to 3 months, did not support these findings. So that is interesting too, which means short-term not much, maybe long-term something. Stevia has been looked at as a weight control substance, but was not found to be useful other than the calorie reduction from avoiding sucrose. So in other words, you're not eating sugar. There's no calories in stevia, and so therefore you're taking in less calories overall, and that's good. That is one way it could be helpful for weight control. But there was one study, a small study, that showed that if you did that in the morning, patients actually ate more in the afternoon, so it actually rebounded. And so I don't think overall that it's very helpful for weight control. We mentioned Ashan, Bashir, and Shah. There we go. Discusses these uses of stevia as well as it being antioxidant and anti-inflammatory, anti-hyperlipidemic, anti-tumor, nephron. We talk about all these, nephron and hepatoprotective, as well as antibacterial and antifungal. These effects were all shown in mice, in rat studies, or in vitro studies, which means in glass, in lab. In other words, these have not been shown in clinical studies. And if it has not been shown in a clinical study, it is not what it does in humans. There was one study, however, with 49 hyperlipidemic patients, which showed no changes in liver function tests, lipids, glucose, or body mass index. In other words, it kind of wiped out everything we've been talking about. It doesn't help lower cholesterol. It doesn't help glucose. It's not hypoglycemic. It doesn't help body mass index, which means it doesn't help lower weight. It just doesn't seem to do anything according to that one study. It was 49, so we're over that hump of getting into the population statistics, but it's still quite a small study. So again, I think overall we need some more studies here. So overall, it appears most of the uses of stevia outside of being a sweetener need a lot more clinical evidence to support their use. I'm just not buying it at this point. So let's talk about some drug-herb interactions. Literature search did not find any general drug-herb interactions involving stevia, including specifically cytochrome P450 and P-glycoprotein. That's how I do these things. I put in stevia, drug-herb interactions, stevia, cytochrome P450 interactions, stevia, P-glycoprotein interactions. I did all those and didn't find anything. And I go down to, I think at least 50 of the results in Google Scholar is usually how I do it. One paper explored interactions with transporter proteins in humans and found no interactions for the major transporter proteins, P-glycoprotein, BRCP, and others. It did find inhibition of O3, which may alter renal clearance, but it did not seem to be very significant in general. Taylor, who wrote that Rainforest Herbs book, says it may potentiate antihypertensive and anti-diabetic medications. And so, when someone says something like that, there's no clinical evidence. You see, if you're looking at my slide, it says D on it. It's D level evidence, which means the lowest level of evidence there is. And so I would, it's just an expert opinion. And given the results of the studies, I wouldn't worry about it potentiating either of those medications. Medline Plus, I did the wrong thing there. Medline Plus says to use moderate caution when combining with lithium as well as antihypertensive and antidiabetic medications. I think it actually got the antihypertensive and antidiabetic medications from the same source, from Taylor. The lithium, it didn't really have a source on. I'm not sure why it should be a caution with lithium. Lithium is a narrow therapeutic index drug. I would be cautious with any herbs with lithium in general. But I don't know why this warrants any more caution than any other herb. And finally, the American Herbal Product Association's Botanical Safety Handbook puts this herb in interaction class A, herbs for which no clinically relevant interactions are expected. And that's where I would land on it as well. So let's talk about some concerns. The U.S. FDA considers stevia, the sweetener, to be generally regarded as safe for grass. The FDA placed an import alert on stevia leaves and crude extracts due to safety concerns and potential for toxicity. Medline Plus says side effects of taking stevia may include nausea, bloating, numbness, and dizziness. One rat study suggests rebaudiana A may disrupt the microbiome, so that's why we would take probiotics and stuff along those lines to protect our microbiome. There we go, interesting. Drugs.com says no major contraindications, warnings, or adverse reactions have been documented. Some sources have suggested a potential for hypersensitivity or allergic reactions with products belonging to the Asteraceae family. However, a review of the literature reveals little documented scientific evidence linking stevia to hypersensitivity or allergic reactions. The PDR for Herbal Medicines says there is clinical evidence of cardiovascular effects from stevia leaves, including reduction of mean arterial pressure and bradycardia, which is a slower heart rate. So that's interesting. That's the distinction between the leaves and the refined substance stevioside and rebaudiana A. So that's interesting. And finally, the American Herbal Product Association's Botanical Safety Handbook puts this herb in safety class 1, herbs that can be safely consumed when used appropriately. So I'm not super concerned about any of the concerns. It seems fairly safe to me. There's a few areas that might be an issue. And again, I would say my biggest issue with this, again, is that it is ultra-processed. I Why I don't know if I want to use the word ultra, but it's very processed. And so I'm concerned with processed foods in general. And so I'd be concerned about using the sugar substitute on that basis. So with that, let's do a summary. We started our discussion today by taking a deep dive into sugar and looking at its biochemistry as well as its Chinese medical aspects. From there, we did our daunting trek into stevia or Stevia rebaudiana. Its use as a sugar substitute seems to be quite safe. While it has many medicinal properties, the evidence is positive for many of them, but the evidence is not strong. Overall, another interesting herb that needs some more research. That's bottom line, it needs some more research. In our next episode, we will be exploring another interesting Chinese herb, Zhihua chrysanthemum floss or chrysanthemum flower. This herb is in the Chinese medical subcategory of cool acrid herbs that release the exterior under the category of release the exterior herbs. It is helpful for certain types of colds and helps the liver and the eyes. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. Please join us for this fascinating episode. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. If you liked this podcast, please do us a huge favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app. I thank you for even considering doing that. And don't forget our amazing continuing education deal at www.integrativemedecinecouncil.org/CEUS1. CEUS1. You can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com. And as usual, we have our bibliography. Thank you.